Rain tapped against the warped windows of the saloon, a thin sheet of mud streaking the glass as thunder rumbled low over the Dakota plains. The scent of stale whiskey, pipe smoke, and sweat clung to the air. Eva Harper stood near the door, soaked from the storm, her hands trembling in silence at her sides. The hem of her calico dress was splattered with dirt. Her auburn hair clung wetly to her face. She was 18. She looked younger. Her father, Thomas Harper, leaned against the bar, face sunken with age and liquor. Once a respected Army scout, now just a ruin in a sweat-stained coat. He downed the last of his drink with shaking hands and staggered toward her. "Come on," he muttered. "Let's get this done." She didn't move. He grabbed her arm, hard. "Don't start." The room quieted. Two men at a poker table paused their game. The piano had long stopped playing. Behind the bar, old Wallace polished the glass, eyes down, pretending not to see. Eva's gaze shifted to the corner booth. A man sat waiting Jedediah Black. His black coat hung heavy on his frame. White streaks ran through his unkempt beard, and his eyes, cold, predatory, settled on her like she was something already bought. A long scar ran from his jaw to his collarbone. He didn't smile, but there was something in his eyes that twisted her gut with dread. Jedediah stood slowly and removed his hat. "She'll do," he said. Eva's breath hitched. Thomas pushed her forward. "She's a good girl," he said quickly, nervously. "Strong, quiet. She won't give you trouble." Eva looked up at him. "Please, Papa." His jaw clenched. His eyes avoided hers. He couldn't meet the look that asked, "Why?" A door creaked behind the bar. A preacher walked out, his collar crooked, face damp with sweat, hands already holding a battered Bible. He looked more ashamed than holy. "Let's begin," the preacher mumbled. "No," Eva whispered. Jedediah's eyes narrowed. "What was that?" her father hissed. "I said no." Louder this time. Thomas slapped her. The sound cracked like a gunshot. She staggered back, hand to her cheek, but didn't cry. The preacher hesitated. Jedediah pulled back his coat, revealing the silver grip of a revolver tucked into his waistband. "Say the vows, girl," he said, "or I'll say them for you." Eva's hands balled into fists. Her heart pounded. The room tilted. She saw the mare in her mind, wild, copper-coated, always near the edge of the woods behind their cabin. She used to watch it run, dreaming she was the one galloping through trees, instead of hanging laundry and avoiding her father's hands. That life, those dreams, died here, in this room. She looked at the preacher. The words came out hollow. "I take this man." Jedediah grinned. The preacher rushed the rest, clearly wanting it over with. He didn't even ask if she wanted to place a ring. She didn't have one. Jedediah shoved a strip of twisted silver wire onto her finger, too big, cold as ice. "It's done," the preacher said. Jedediah nodded toward the bar. Thomas grabbed the coin pouch off the counter with shaking hands, not daring to look back at his daughter. "Don't follow me," he said, and staggered out into the rain. Eva stared at the door long after it shut. Jedediah stepped up beside her. "You'll learn to be grateful," he said. "I saved you from starving." She didn't answer. That night, the cabin smelled of damp wood and mold. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. Jedediah moved around like he owned everything. He did now, including her. She sat on the edge of the bed, unmoving, every muscle locked. Her wedding dress, if it could be called that, lay in a heap on the floor. She wore an old nightgown, cotton worn thin from years. Her hands were cold. Jedediah sat sharpening his knife by the fire. The scraping sound dragged across her nerves. "You're awful quiet," he said. Still, she said nothing. He stood and walked over. She tensed. He didn't touch her. Not yet. Just leaned close, eyes glittering. "You belong to me now," he whispered. "Speak when spoken to. Obey when told. You'll find life easier that way." He went to bed, lay down, boots and all, and soon began to snore. Eva sat still until the fire burned low. At some point, she stood, quiet as a shadow, and walked to the single window. Rain blurred the world outside. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the trees in the distance. Somewhere out there was the wild mare. Somewhere out there was freedom. She placed her palm on the cold glass. Behind her, Jedediah shifted and muttered in his sleep. The floor creaked beneath her feet. Eva whispered to the darkness. Someone, anyone. She didn't finish the prayer. Didn't need to. She just watched the trees. And out there, deep in the woods beyond the reach of firelight, something watched her back. The weeks crawled by like wounded animals. Jedediah's cabin, tucked between wind-worn bluffs and snarled pine, became a prison built of wood and silence. Eva learned how to hide bruises beneath sleeves, how to speak only when spoken to, how to breathe without drawing notice. She learned that the man who now called her wife had no softness left in him, only suspicion, violence, and a thirst for control. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was to curse the weather, the law, the Lakota, or her. Mostly her. At night, when he snored heavy with whiskey, Eva slipped from bed and crept outside to the back of the clearing. There, beneath a patch of moonlight, stood the copper mare. Wild, wary. She never let Eva close enough to touch, but she lingered, a silent witness. Eva whispered to her each night, stories of escape, of stars, of dreams stitched from pieces of another life. The horse never ran. Not yet. One morning, Jedediah returned with blood on his knuckles and a twisted grin on his face. Shot a man down at the saloon, he said casually, tossing his hat onto the table. Cheated me in poker. Eva looked up. Is he dead? Not yet, but he'll wish he was. He poured himself a drink, eyes glinting with something darker than amusement. Town's getting soft. Don't much care for a man enforcing what's his. He turned, noticed her stare. What? Nothing, she whispered, turning back to the stew she stirred. You got something to say, girl, you say it. He snapped. She didn't. He walked away. She exhaled, barely. That night, the pounding came at the door. Eva jolted awake as Jedediah reached for his rifle. He cracked the door open just enough to show his face. Sheriff sent word, said a low voice outside. You best ride out, Black. Folks riled up about that boy you near killed. Ain't safe here for you no more. Jedediah shut the door without answering. Then he turned to Eva, eyes blazing. Pack. What? You heard me. We're riding tonight. Within the hour, they were on horseback. Eva's fingers were raw from the cold, her legs sore from riding. Jedediah didn't speak, just rode, always watching the tree line, always glancing back like ghosts nipped at his heels. They rode west, into deeper wilderness. No trails, no signs, only wind and rock and silence. Eva's stomach ached with hunger. Her limbs grew heavier. With each mile, the days blurred. Nights were worse. She barely slept, her ears tuned for footsteps, gunshots, wolves. One morning, as frost crusted the ferns and the horses drank from a narrow stream, Jedediah froze mid-step, rifle in hand. He scanned the woods. They're watching us, he muttered. Who? Eva asked, heart lurching. Lakota, savages. I seen one last night. Thought I dreamed it. But he was there, standing, watching. Eva looked toward the trees, but saw only shadows. He stalked off, muttering to himself, boots crunching through underbrush. Eva stood still, unsure whether to follow or run. And then, out of the corner of her eye, movement. A branch flexed. A figure stood 20 paces away, half shrouded in pine. Tall, still, dressed in furs and paint. His eyes locked with hers. Eva's breath caught. The figure didn't move, didn't threaten, just watched. And then he was gone. She blinked, unsure she imagined it. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She said nothing to Jedediah when he returned, swearing about traps and war parties. They moved camp again that night. The cold deepened. Eva's hands turned blue beneath her gloves. Snowflakes drifted down like ash. Jedediah grew jumpy, hearing things, muttering names from some other time. Then came the bear. It crashed into camp before sunrise, a hulking blur of fur and hunger. Jedediah fired once, missed. The bear roared. Eva screamed and stumbled backward. Jedediah tried again, but the rifle jammed. The bear lunged. Eva turned and ran into the woods, feet slipping on frost, branches clawing her skin. Behind her, shouts, a growl, a gunshot, then silence. She didn't stop until her lungs burned. She collapsed beneath a pine, shaking. And then, arms. Strong. Sure. She cried out and tried to pull away, but they held her gently, firmly. She looked up. It was him, the figure from the woods. His face was marked with blue paint beneath his eyes, long braids draped with bone beads. He said nothing, just crouched beside her, watching. She expected cruelty. Instead, calm, a sense of steadiness, like the earth beneath her had stopped shaking. He didn't touch her again, simply motioned for her to follow. Behind them, a distant scream, Jedediah's voice ragged with pain. Eva stood. She didn't ask why she followed. She just knew she couldn't go back. The smell of smoke and pine lingered in Eva's nose when she woke. Her body ached, but the pain was distant, muted, like a memory she hadn't decided to recall yet. A bearskin was draped over her, thick and warm, and faint firelight danced across the inner hide walls of a teepee. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. A baby cried. The sound of scraping wood and low, rhythmic drumming floated to the cold dawn air. She sat up too quickly and gasped. Her side flared in pain. A hand pressed gently against her shoulder, steadying her. He sat beside her, the Lakota warrior, Chaska. He watched her, his face unreadable but not unkind. His presence was quiet, an extension of the earth itself. He didn't speak. Not yet. Only nodded toward a clay bowl beside her. Stew, hot and fragrant. Her stomach growled. She reached for it with trembling hands and ate without asking questions. The meat was tender, the broth rich with roots and something wild. Nourishment wrapped itself around her like a second blanket. She hadn't felt full in weeks. She looked up at him. Thank you. He gave no reply, but his gaze softened slightly, just for a second, then returned to stillness. Outside, voices spoke in Lakota, not angry, curious, cautious. She could feel the air tighten beyond the hide walls, like the camp braced itself for her presence. By midday, she was helped out of the teepee by a woman older than anyone she'd ever seen. Her skin was lined with time and sun, her eyes sharp as eagle talons. She said nothing either, but handed Eva a carved wooden cup of water and led her around the camp like a silent guardian. The people watched her with suspicion, some with open hostility. A few children pointed. A man muttered something and spat in the dirt. Eva kept her head down. That night, Chaska sat near the fire, sharpening a long blade. Eva crouched nearby, weaving dry grass under the instruction of the old woman, whose name she learned was Wiaka, which meant feather. Every so often, Eva glanced at Chaska. He worked silently, his hands callous but graceful. She noticed how others deferred to him, not out of fear, but respect. He had saved her. He had no reason to. On the third day, she spoke again. Why did you help me? He didn't look at her. Because you were not his. His voice was deep, even like stone breaking a still pond. That night, she dreamed of wolves circling a lone deer and a figure standing between them, unarmed. The days passed slowly. Her body healed. She learned the rhythm of the village, the way smoke curled from the cook fires at dawn, the laughter of children chasing dogs, the low hum of ceremony when the sun dipped low. She began to help Wiaka gather firewood, prepare hides, clean fish. At first, people avoided her. Then, one child brought her a piece of sweet root. A woman smiled when Eva chased a loose goat. The walls began to thin, not fall, but soften. Chaska showed her how to set a snare, how to walk silently on frost, how to read the sky. He still didn't speak much, but words weren't needed. She began to understand him in gestures. A tilt of his head meant follow. A furrowed brow meant danger. A quiet sigh at night meant he was thinking of something heavy, something from before. Eva didn't ask. She knew the ache of old ghosts. One afternoon, while she helped Wiaka grind corn, a scout rode into camp. Dusty, wide-eyed, speaking quickly in Lakota. The mood shifted. Tension rippled like wind through grass. Men gathered near the central fire. Eva stood at the edge, listening. Wiaka translated in hushed tones. White men, armed, 3 days east, searching for you. Her throat tightened. Jedediah, he had lived. Of course he had. Monsters didn't die in the dark. They waited. That night, Chaska sharpened his arrows with more focus. Eva sat beside him, hands wrapped in a shawl. I should go, she whispered. I brought danger. Chaska didn't stop working. If you run, he will find you alone. I can't let them fight for me. I'm not worth. His eyes snapped to hers, fierce. You are not his. You are not a thing to trade or beat. You are woman. You are life. She couldn't speak. Her throat burned with something deeper than fear, grief, maybe, or gratitude, or the seed of something just beginning to bloom. He reached into a pouch and handed her a pendant, a carved bone circle, smooth and pale. For protection, he said. My mother wore it. She clutched it tightly. Thank you. They sat together until the stars bloomed above the black canopy. Wind moved through the trees like a whisper. In the shadows, war stirred. And somewhere across the wild land, Jedediah Black followed blood like a hound with a scent he wouldn't release. Eva looked into the fire and did not flinch. This time, she wouldn't run. Fog crept low across the valley, like a living thing. It slid between the pine trunks, coiling around the Lakota village like a pale serpent. Dawn had not yet broken, but the camp was awake. Fires burned low. Weapons were checked in silence. The warriors painted their faces red and black streaks carved in determination. Eva stood among them, the bone pendant resting warm against her chest, her breath steaming in the chill air. She wasn't hiding. She stood beside Chaska, his bow in hand, his eyes distant and sharp. He hadn't said much that morning. He didn't need to. The truth lay in every movement. The quiet way he checked the leather on her moccasins, how he placed a small knife in her hand, without a word. If they come, he'd said, don't think. Move. Her fingers tightened around the blade. She could barely feel them. The frost had bitten through her gloves, but she refused to shiver. Fear was a luxury she'd burned away under the weight of weeks in the wilderness. There was no space left for it now. Wiaka stood at the center of the camp. The women and children huddled behind her, bundles packed, horses ready. The plan was simple. If the enemy breached the line, they would flee west. Chaska and the warriors would hold the front. Eva wasn't supposed to be here, but she hadn't asked for permission. She had no more cages left to tolerate. The first shot came at sunrise. A crack rang through the trees like a thunderclap, startling birds from the canopy. Then came the shouting, boots in the dirt, war cries rising from both sides as the enemy charged through the trees. Jedediah's men, ragged ex-soldiers and bounty hunters, faces twisted with greed and anger. Chaska loosed his first arrow. It struck a rider square in the chest, knocking him from his horse. Eva ducked behind a boulder, heart hammering as bullets tore through bark and air. Screams echoed, some from men, others from horses. She peeked out and saw chaos, bodies in motion, smoke curling from rifle barrels, warriors weaving through trees with the fluidity of wind. Then she saw him, Jedediah. He rode a black horse through the carnage, wild-eyed, coat flapping like wings. A scar split his face. Blood marked one sleeve. His revolver roared as he fired into trees, yelling her name like a curse. Eva. She froze. He was alive. Real. And he was coming. Chaska saw him too. He moved to intercept, but a bullet caught him high in the arm. He fell to one knee. Eva screamed his name and rushed from cover. Jedediah spotted her, his face lit with something vile. He spurred his horse forward, bellowing, "Come home, girl." Eva ran to Chaska, helped him to his feet. Blood soaked through his leathers, but he stood. He raised his bow with shaking hands. Jedediah dismounted. He stalked toward them, revolver raised. "You think you're safe with them?" he sneered. "You think that redskin loves you? You're mine." Chaska stepped in front of her, eyes blazing. He dropped the bow, too slow now to draw it, and pulled a long knife from his belt. Jedediah fired. The bullet missed, barely. Chaska charged. They collided like beasts, man against man, fury against fury. Chaska's blade slashed across Jedediah's arm, drawing blood. Jedediah roared and slammed the butt of his gun into Chaska's temple. He stumbled back. Eva moved without thinking. She snatched Chaska's fallen tomahawk from the dirt and rushed Jedediah as he raised his revolver again. He turned too late. She swung. The blade caught him across the face, then again across the shoulder. He howled, staggering back, gun falling from his hand. He lunged at her, grabbing her by the throat. "I made you," he snarled. "You were mine." Her vision blurred. She kicked, clawed, but he was too strong. Until a hand, Chaska's, wrapped around Jedediah's wrist and twisted. There was a snap, a scream. Eva dropped to her knees, gasping. Jedediah staggered back, clutching his broken arm. Blood dripped from his face. He looked at her one last time, eyes not angry but betrayed. He whispered, "Your father sold you for a bottle girl. You were never more than that." Then Chaska drove the blade into his chest. Jedediah fell. Hard, the fog swallowed him. Silence returned slowly, like a creature testing its footing. The gunfire ceased. The last of the enemy fled. The battle was over. Eva sat beside Chaska, hands shaking, heart hammering. He bled from his shoulder, his head, his side. But he smiled. "You live," he said. "So do you," she whispered, cradling his face. "Don't you dare leave me." He closed his eyes, breathing slow, deep, not in pain, just tired. She held him until the cold began to bite again. By midday, they buried the dead in a grove of cedar. Wiaka placed black stones over each grave, whispering names. When she passed Eva, she placed a hand on her shoulder, not as comfort, but recognition. That evening, as the sun bled across the sky, Eva stood atop the hill and stared at the world beyond. Chaska stood behind her, arm in a sling, face calm. "You don't have to stay," he said. "You owe us nothing." "I know." She turned to him. "But this is my home now." His eyes searched hers. He nodded once. They said nothing more. Weeks passed. The earth thawed. The first wildflowers appeared in the valley. Eva rode the copper mare across the plains, Chaska beside her, the wind in their hair. One morning, they stopped by a tree alone on a ridge. At its base was a crude cross. Eva knelt, brushed the dirt from the carved letters. Thomas Harper. She didn't cry. She didn't curse. She only whispered, "I forgive you." Then she stood, took Chaska's hand, and walked into the rising light.